Hi folks, let's do chapter 14. We'll call this part 1. We're going to cover oligopoly, and I'll remind you of the characteristics. I'm also going to characterize oligopoly as a problem. It's problematic because it's so hard to model, and it's going to require a variety of different approaches. In this lecture, I'm going to show you one of those, which is the cartel model. Let's go ahead and get started. If you'll remember, oligopolies are characterized by a few big firms. They're going to differentiate their products, and they're going to have significant barriers to entry. The three of these taken collectively together are often a sign of significant market power. In other words, they're going to be able to raise their price quite a bit in some situations without losing that many customers. Good examples of this are Boeing and Airbus, Coke and Pepsi. In the hockey industry, you've got CCM, Bauer, and Graf. You can probably think of a few others where an industry seems to be dominated by only a few big firms. Those firms have a lot of power, and oftentimes we expect them to make pretty good money. Occasionally, competition gets so fierce that they end up making pretty small amounts of money, much more similar to a monopolistically competitive industry. For further insight on this, you can read about the 5 forces model, which is presented in your textbook. It gives you a good sense of how much an oligopolist is actually going to be able to get away with in terms of raising prices and collecting profits, and to what extent they actually end up bleeding some of those profits back away. All right. The reason that we think of oligopoly as being problematic is because every oligopolistic firm has to worry about their peers. This is unique to some extent. Perfectly competitive firms are too small. They don't worry about anyone else. Monopolists don't have any peers. And monocomp firms, to some extent, also can just sort of focus on their differentiations and not worry about much else other than what's their Q star. In an oligopoly, everyone's large enough to significantly influence price and quantity outcomes for everyone. What this means is one big firm like Boeing changing their mind about production is going to swing the overall prices and quantities for the entire market. It's very, very significant for Airbus. What this amounts to is that no one can really afford to ignore the actions of their peers. They are constantly thinking about, what if Boeing does this? What does that mean for me if I'm Airbus? This creates a very dynamic environment that's often unique to specific industries. And, of course, it makes it incredibly difficult to generalize to a model that will fit for all oligopolistic markets. What you oftentimes see in textbooks is 4, 5, multiple ways of trying to explain how and why oligopolists behave. I'm going to show you one in this lecture, which will sort of set a boundary of what's the best thing that they could possibly do. The ideal thing for an oligopolist to do is to not compete with other oligopolists. If they all agree to not compete, they can essentially form a cartel, and a cartel will allow them to behave as a monopolist. They make the maximum amount of profits, and then they can split them up. This is, of course, ideal. However, it is absolutely illegal. Firms cannot do this. Otherwise, they face prosecution under the law. That doesn't mean that they don't try to get away with it, though. So, what you can see here is I've basically got a demand curve and the resultant total revenue and marginal revenue numbers that go along with every spot on that demand curve. If you had a monopolist and they were facing marginal costs equal to zero, let's say they have zero fixed costs as well, then you would see that they would want to produce at a spot where MC was equal to MR, 0. This would be the spot that a monopolist would generate, and at Q equals 7, they would generate $42 in total revenue. Two oligopolists could split up the revenue associated with that quantity, and they could earn $21 each. This is an ideal for them. They compete with each other, and they actually try to provide more quantity beyond 7 in order to get customers. They drive the price down, and they ruin their profitability. So, cartels, of course, are really attractive as long as firms can trust each other and they can maintain discipline, right? There's a reason that cartels are associated with the drug world. The drug world's trying to force out all of their competition, keep everybody on the same page in a specific product market. And of course, they enforce discipline with brute force and threats of violence. By doing that, they're basically trying to hold up the prices for their product. The same thing with firms, they're just less likely to kill each other. Okay, so why aren't we seeing cartels everywhere? One, we had the good sense to make them illegal, but also you'll find that a lot of conservatives will argue that they're difficult to maintain without the threat of violence. The reason that this is the case is because if you have these two firms splitting up the market and one of them decides that they're going to cheat, then they actually increase quantity, let's say by 2, while the other one, let's say, maintains the required quantity of 7. Well, what happens for both of these firms? Well, the cheater firm now would produce half of the 7 plus 2 more. So 3.5 plus 2, let's say that quantity goes to 5.5. And the straight firm, of course, continues to behave the way they're supposed to. Right? They're playing a straight game. Well, quantity overall now equals 9. And if you have 9 units, that means that it is going to sell for $4 each. Grand total in revenue is $36, which of course is less than the 42 that a monopolist would generate that they were splitting. Well, what does this mean for our individual players here? The one who tried to cheat is actually going to sell 5.5 units at 4 a pop. This means that they're going to generate for themselves $22 in total revenue. Our poor player who was trying to play by the rules is actually going to be left with only $14 of revenue. Of course, the minute that one player cheats, they destroy the trust, discipline's been broken, and the cartel has a tendency to fall apart. This is why a lot of conservatives think that you're not actually likely to see cartels over time, because individual firms have an incentive to cheat. Okay, there's the basics of a cartel approach. It's ideal because you can generate the most money, but it's also illegal, right? And some folks would argue, as we've drawn out here, that there's an incentive for firms to cheat on the cartel and it will fall apart.